Question 1. Strategic planning requires a driver to anticipate potential hazards and apply Washington state traffic laws. While approaching an intersection in Washington state, you are facing a green light. A pedestrian is in the crosswalk, and you are unsure if they have fully cleared the intersection. What is the most responsible course of action to ensure compliance with Washington state traffic regulations and promote safety? Option A. Stop before the crosswalk and wait for the pedestrian to completely clear the intersection before proceeding, even with a green light. Option B. Proceed through the intersection cautiously, assuming the pedestrian will move quickly. Option C. Honk your horn to alert the pedestrian to your presence and encourage them to hurry. Option D. Slow down slightly but continue through the intersection, as the green light indicates your right-of-way. Correct answer is A. Stop before the crosswalk and wait for the pedestrian to completely clear the intersection before proceeding, even with a green light. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the Washington State Driver Guide and its implications for safe driving practices. This scenario presents a challenge because it tests the applicant's ability to apply learned knowledge to a real-world driving situation, specifically concerning yielding the right-of-way in a complex intersection. The difficulty lies in interpreting the nuances of traffic control devices and the responsibilities of drivers in ensuring pedestrian and vehicle safety. The correct approach involves prioritizing the established rules of the road as outlined in the Washington State Driver Guide, particularly regarding yielding to pedestrians in marked crosswalks and understanding the hierarchy of traffic control devices. This approach is correct because Washington state law, as detailed in the Driver Guide, mandates that drivers must yield to pedestrians in crosswalks, whether marked or unmarked, and must obey traffic signals and signs. Failing to do so constitutes a violation of traffic laws and creates a significant safety hazard. An incorrect approach would be to assume the green light grants absolute right-of-way without considering other road users. This fails to acknowledge the legal and ethical obligation to yield to pedestrians, which is a fundamental principle of safe driving in Washington state. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed cautiously, but without explicitly yielding, which could still be interpreted as a failure to give way and could lead to a dangerous situation or a citation. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed over safety by assuming other drivers will yield is a direct contravention of the defensive driving principles emphasized in the Washington State Driver Guide and is inherently unsafe. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the applicable traffic laws and regulations from the Washington State Driver Guide. This involves recognizing all traffic control devices and potential hazards, such as pedestrians. The next step is to assess the responsibilities of all parties involved and to act in a manner that prioritizes safety and compliance with the law. If there is any ambiguity or potential for conflict, the safest course of action, which aligns with regulatory requirements, is to yield. Question 2. Strategic planning requires a licensing agent at the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) to assess an applicant's readiness for a driving test. If an applicant arrives exhibiting clear signs of impairment, such as slurred speech and unsteady gait, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action according to Washington state regulations? Option A. Administer the test as scheduled, assuming the applicant can manage their condition sufficiently to pass. Option B. Politely inform the applicant that they cannot proceed with the test due to observed impairment and advise them to reschedule after addressing the issue, ensuring adherence to Washington State DOL safety protocols. Option C. Suggest the applicant take a short break and drink some water, then attempt the test. Option D. Proceed with the driving test, but make a mental note to be extra vigilant during the examination. The correct answer is B. Politely inform the applicant that they cannot proceed with the test due to observed impairment and advise them to reschedule after addressing the issue, ensuring adherence to Washington State DOL safety protocols. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a driver's license with the absolute requirement of ensuring public safety on Washington state roadways. The applicant's potential impairment presents a direct risk to themselves and others. A licensing agent must exercise sound judgment, adhering strictly to Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) regulations and the Washington State Driver Guide, without succumbing to pressure or making assumptions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective assessment of the applicant's fitness to drive. strictly adhering to Washington state DOL procedures. This means recognizing the signs of potential impairment, politely but firmly explaining that the applicant cannot proceed with the test at this time due to safety concerns and regulatory requirements, and advising them to reschedule after addressing the underlying issue. This approach is correct because it directly upholds Washington state's commitment to road safety, as mandated by Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-021, which grants the DOL authority to deny licenses to individuals deemed unfit to operate a motor vehicle. It also aligns with the ethical obligation of licensing agents to protect the public. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the test despite visible signs of impairment is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates the DOL's mandate to ensure all drivers are competent and safe, potentially leading to accidents and injuries, and exposing the state to liability. Ignoring the applicant's condition to avoid confrontation or perceived inconvenience is unprofessional and demonstrates a disregard for public safety, contravening the core purpose of driver licensing. Suggesting the applicant try their best or take it easy is equally unacceptable, as it implies a willingness to overlook a critical safety issue and bypass established testing protocols. This approach fails to uphold the integrity of the licensing process and the safety standards set forth by Washington state law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance above all else. This involves 1. Recognizing and documenting observable indicators of potential impairment. 2. Consulting relevant sections of the Washington State Driver Guide and DOL policy regarding applicant fitness. 3. Communicating clearly and respectfully with the applicant, explaining the inability to proceed based on observed conditions and policy. 4. Following established procedures for rescheduling or requiring further evaluation. This systematic approach ensures decisions are objective, defensible, and aligned with the paramount goal of public safety on Washington's roads. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of Washington state's driver licensing regulations. When processing a driver's license application for an individual presenting a foreign passport and a letter from a local community organization vouching for their residency, what is the most compliant and professionally responsible course of action according to Washington state's Department of Licensing, DOL, procedures? Option A. Accept the foreign passport as valid primary identification and the community organization's letter as sufficient proof of residency, provided the applicant can verbally attest to their driving experience. Option B. Reject the application outright due to the unfamiliarity of the foreign passport and the non-standard proof of residency, without further investigation into acceptable alternatives. Option C. Meticulously verify the foreign passport against the DOL's list of acceptable primary identification documents and require additional, standard Washington state proof of residency, such as utility bills or a lease agreement, while also ensuring all testing requirements are met. Option D. Expedite the application process by accepting the foreign passport and the community organization's letter, and waive the driving skills test due to the applicant's stated need for immediate transportation. The correct answer is C. Meticulously verify the foreign passport against the DOL's list of acceptable primary identification documents and require additional, standard Washington state proof of residency, such as utility bills or a lease agreement, while also ensuring all testing requirements are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a driver's license with the absolute requirement of ensuring the applicant meets all Washington state legal and safety standards. Misinterpreting or circumventing these requirements can lead to issuing a license to an unqualified individual, posing a significant risk to public safety and violating the core mandate of the Washington State Department of Licensing, DOL. The pressure to process applications efficiently must not compromise the integrity of the licensing process. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves meticulously verifying all documentation against Washington State's established driver's licensing requirements, as outlined in the Revised Code of Washington, RCW, and Washington Administrative Code, WAC, pertaining to driver licensing. This includes confirming the applicant's identity, residency, legal presence, and successful completion of all mandated testing, vision, knowledge, and driving skills. Adhering strictly to these established procedures ensures compliance with state law, upholds public safety standards, and maintains the credibility of the DOL. This approach prioritizes legal and safety mandates above all else. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting a foreign identification document that is not explicitly recognized by Washington state as a valid primary identification for licensing purposes, even if it appears legitimate. This fails to comply with the specific identity verification requirements mandated by the DOL, potentially allowing an unqualified individual to obtain a license. Another incorrect approach is to waive the driving skills test based on the applicant's assertion of prior driving experience without proper verification, or a recognized reciprocal agreement between Washington state and the applicant's previous jurisdiction. Washington state law requires all applicants to demonstrate proficiency through its own testing procedures unless specific exceptions are met, which are clearly defined. A further incorrect approach is to overlook discrepancies in the applicant's proof of residency, such as incomplete utility bills or mail not addressed to the applicant at the stated address. The DOL has specific criteria for acceptable proof of residency, and failing to meet these criteria means the applicant has not demonstrated they reside in Washington state, a prerequisite for licensing. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and rule-based decision-making process. This involves thoroughly understanding the specific requirements of Washington state's driver licensing laws and regulations. When faced with an applicant, the process should be: 1. Verify identity and legal presence using only approved documentation. 2. Confirm residency through acceptable proof. 3. Ensure all required testing has been successfully completed according to DOL standards. 4. If any documentation or testing is questionable or does not meet explicit requirements, seek clarification from supervisors or consult the official DOL policy manuals. The guiding principle is always adherence to the law and the protection of public safety. Question 4. The assessment process reveals that while approaching an intersection in Washington state, you have a green light, but another vehicle is already proceeding through the intersection, appearing to have run a red light. What is the most appropriate action to take? Option A. Honk your horn to alert the other driver and then proceed. Option B. Proceed through the intersection at your normal speed, assuming the other vehicle will stop. Option C. Be prepared to stop or slow down to avoid a collision, even though you have the green light. Option D. Stop completely before the intersection and wait for the other vehicle to clear, regardless of your green light. The correct answer is C. Be prepared to stop or slow down to avoid a collision, even though you have the green light. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge for new drivers in Washington state: understanding the nuanced application of traffic laws in real-world scenarios, particularly concerning yielding and right-of-way. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not just memorization of rules, but the ability to interpret and apply them under pressure, considering the actions of other road users. Careful judgment is required to prioritize safety and legal compliance. The correct approach involves recognizing that, while the driver has the right-of-way, the primary responsibility is to avoid a collision. This means being prepared to yield even if technically entitled to proceed, especially when another vehicle is already in the intersection or appears to be disregarding the traffic signal. This aligns with the fundamental principle of defensive driving, which emphasizes anticipating potential hazards and acting to prevent accidents, a core tenet of safe driving practices encouraged by the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) and reflected in the Washington State Driver Guide. The law, while granting right-of-way, does not absolve a driver of the duty to exercise reasonable care. An incorrect approach would be to rigidly assert the right-of-way without assessing the immediate situation. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and a failure to prioritize safety over strict adherence to a rule that might be misinterpreted or ignored by another driver. This approach violates the spirit of safe driving and could lead to a collision, which is a direct contravention of the objective of the driver's license assessment. Another incorrect approach is to assume the other driver will stop, even if they are approaching a red light. This is a dangerous assumption that relies on predicting the behavior of others, which is inherently unreliable. The Washington State Driver Guide explicitly warns against making assumptions about other drivers' actions. Finally, An incorrect approach is to become distracted by the other driver's actions and hesitate unnecessarily, potentially causing a traffic disruption or a rear-end collision. While awareness is crucial, indecision can be as hazardous as aggressive assertion. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, followed by legal compliance. This involves continuous scanning of the environment, anticipating potential hazards, and making proactive decisions to avoid collisions. When in doubt, it is always safer to yield. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates that a driver approaching a marked crosswalk in Seattle, Washington, observes a pedestrian standing on the sidewalk, looking in both directions but not yet stepping into the street. The pedestrian is not signaling to cross. What is the legally compliant and safest action for the driver to take? Option A. Slow down and be prepared to stop, yielding the right-of-way to the pedestrian if they enter the crosswalk. Option B. Proceed through the crosswalk cautiously as the pedestrian has not yet entered the roadway. Option C. Stop briefly and then proceed if the pedestrian seems hesitant to cross. Option D. Honk the horn to alert the pedestrian and then proceed if they appear to be waiting. The correct answer is A. Slow down and be prepared to stop, yielding the right-of-way to the pedestrian if they enter the crosswalk. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to demonstrate an understanding of Washington state's specific traffic laws regarding yielding to pedestrians, even when the pedestrian's actions might seem unexpected or inconvenient. The challenge lies in prioritizing safety and legal compliance over personal judgment or impatience, which can be difficult in real-time driving situations. Careful judgment is required to interpret the pedestrian's intent and apply the correct legal standard for yielding. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to always yield to a pedestrian who is in or entering a crosswalk, regardless of whether they have a signal or appear to be in immediate danger. This approach aligns with Washington State's Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46/61/235, which mandates that drivers yield the right-of-way to pedestrians in a crosswalk. The law is designed to protect vulnerable road users and places a clear responsibility on drivers to anticipate and accommodate pedestrian presence. This proactive approach to safety and legal compliance is paramount. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed through the crosswalk because the pedestrian has not yet stepped off the curb. This fails to recognize that RCW 46/61/235 also applies to pedestrians entering a crosswalk, implying that a pedestrian intending to cross must be given the right-of-way. This approach prioritizes the driver's convenience over the pedestrian's safety and legal right. Another incorrect approach is to honk the horn to alert the pedestrian and then proceed. This is not only discourteous, but also potentially escalates a situation unnecessarily. More importantly, it bypasses the legal requirement to yield. The law does not permit drivers to use their horn to compel a pedestrian to move faster or to override the yielding requirement. A third incorrect approach is to stop briefly and then proceed if the pedestrian appears hesitant. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to the legal requirement to yield. The law requires drivers to yield until the pedestrian has safely cleared the driver's lane or half of the roadway in their direction of travel. Hesitation by the pedestrian does not negate the driver's obligation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing the safety of all road users and adhering strictly to the letter of the law. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the presence of a pedestrian in or near a crosswalk. 2. Recalling the specific Washington State Law RCW 46/61/235 regarding yielding to pedestrians. 3. Applying the law by yielding the right-of-way, even if it causes a minor delay. 4. Understanding that the law is designed for protection and not subject to driver interpretation of pedestrian intent or urgency. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a driver education instructor in Washington State has a student who is struggling with parallel parking but consistently performs well on all other required maneuvers for the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) driving test. The student is eager to take the test next week. What is the most responsible course of action for the instructor? Option A. Recommend that the student practice parallel parking independently without supervision, as the instructor has covered the basic technique. Option B. Advise the student to attempt the test, focusing on their strengths and hoping the examiner is lenient on the parallel parking component. Option C. Pass the student's training record as complete, assuming that the DOL examiner will provide sufficient guidance during the test for the parallel parking maneuver. Option D. Continue to provide targeted practice and instruction on parallel parking until the student demonstrates consistent proficiency, even if it means delaying the test date. The correct answer is D. Continue to provide targeted practice and instruction on parallel parking until the student demonstrates consistent proficiency, even if it means delaying the test date. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a driver education instructor in Washington State. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for a student to pass their driving test with the paramount importance of ensuring the student possesses the necessary skills and judgment to operate a vehicle safely and legally on Washington roadways. Overlooking critical safety aspects for the sake of a quick pass would not only violate ethical teaching principles, but also contravene the spirit and intent of Washington's driver licensing regulations, which prioritize public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough assessment of the student's readiness based on their demonstrated ability to consistently and safely execute all required maneuvers and adhere to Washington state traffic laws. This includes not only the technical execution of skills like parallel parking or three-point turns, but also their understanding and application of defensive driving principles, hazard perception, and responsible decision-making in various traffic situations. The instructor must ensure the student can operate the vehicle competently and safely without direct supervision, as mandated by the Washington State Department of Licensing, DOL, for licensing. This approach prioritizes long-term safety and compliance over short-term test success. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to focus solely on the specific maneuvers that are known to be tested on the Washington DOL driving test, neglecting other essential driving skills and safety considerations. This fails to equip the student with the comprehensive competence required for real-world driving and could lead to dangerous situations on public roads, violating the DOL's objective of licensing safe drivers. Another incorrect approach is to overlook minor errors or unsafe habits if the student can still technically perform the required test maneuvers. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to instilling safe driving practices and a disregard for the potential risks associated with such habits, which could lead to accidents and violate the DOL's emphasis on safe operation. A further incorrect approach is to pressure the student to pass the test even if they are not fully prepared, perhaps due to external pressures or a desire to complete the training quickly. This compromises the instructor's professional responsibility to ensure the student is a safe and competent driver, potentially leading to licensing of an unprepared individual and contravening the DOL's mandate to protect public safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals in driver education must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance above all else. This involves a continuous assessment of the student's skills against established safety standards and Washington state traffic laws. When a student demonstrates a consistent ability to drive safely and competently, adhering to all rules, then they are ready for the test. If there are persistent deficiencies, the professional's duty is to provide further instruction and practice until those deficiencies are rectified, ensuring the student meets the licensing requirements for the safety of themselves and others on Washington's roads. Question 7. The performance metrics show a significant increase in drivers failing the Washington State Department of Licensing knowledge test, specifically concerning their understanding of right-of-way rules at uncontrolled intersections. Considering the Washington State Driver Guide and the DOL's commitment to road safety, what is the most effective and compliant strategy to address this trend? Option A. Increase the number of questions related to right-of-way at uncontrolled intersections on the knowledge test without altering the existing question format or providing additional study resources. Option B. Lower the passing score for the Washington State DOL knowledge test to account for the observed difficulty with right-of-way rules. Option C. Develop supplementary educational materials and revise the knowledge test to include more scenario-based questions on right-of-way at uncontrolled intersections, while ensuring the educational materials align with the Washington State Driver Guide. Option D. Implement a policy that requires drivers who fail the knowledge test on right-of-way rules to attend a mandatory, uncompensated traffic school focused solely on this topic. The correct answer is C. Develop supplementary educational materials and revise the knowledge test to include more scenario-based questions on right-of-way at uncontrolled intersections, while ensuring the educational materials align with the Washington State Driver Guide. Explanation: the performance metrics show a concerning trend in the number of drivers failing the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) knowledge test due to a lack of understanding of right-of-way rules at uncontrolled intersections. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts public safety on Washington state roadways. Ensuring drivers possess a fundamental understanding of traffic laws, particularly those governing interactions with other vehicles, is paramount to preventing accidents. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the performance dip and implement effective remedial strategies that align with Washington State's traffic safety objectives. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy that directly addresses the identified knowledge gap. This includes reviewing the current testing methodology for the Washington State DOL knowledge test to ensure clarity and accuracy in questions related to right-of-way at uncontrolled intersections. Furthermore, it necessitates developing supplementary educational materials, such as targeted online modules or in-person workshops, that specifically explain and illustrate these rules using scenarios common to Washington State's road network. Finally, incorporating more scenario-based questions within the knowledge test itself, focusing on practical application rather than rote memorization, would better assess a driver's comprehension. This approach is correct because it directly targets the identified deficiency, utilizes approved DOL educational resources and testing principles, and aims to improve actual driver comprehension and application of critical safety rules, thereby enhancing road safety in Washington State. An incorrect approach would be to simply increase the number of questions on right-of-way without addressing the underlying comprehension issues. This fails to recognize that the problem is not a lack of exposure to the topic, but a lack of understanding. Another incorrect approach would be to lower the passing score for the knowledge test. This is ethically and regulatorily unacceptable, as it compromises the minimum standard of competency required for a driver's license and directly contradicts the goal of ensuring safe drivers on Washington state roads. Lastly, focusing solely on punitive measures for those who fail, without providing additional learning opportunities, ignores the educational mandate of the DOL and is unlikely to improve overall driver knowledge or safety. Professionals should employ a data-driven decision-making process. This involves first analyzing performance metrics to pinpoint specific areas of weakness. Then, they should consult relevant Washington State DOL regulations and driver education guidelines to understand the required competencies. Based on this analysis, they should develop targeted interventions that are both educational and evaluative, ensuring that any changes to the testing or educational process are aligned with the state's commitment to road safety and driver competency. Question 8. The evaluation methodology shows that a new resident of Washington State has purchased a vehicle in Oregon and driven it into Washington. They have been using the vehicle for 2 months with Oregon plates, believing they have ample time to register it in Washington. Based on Washington State's regulatory framework for vehicle registration, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance? Option A. Assume that since the vehicle was purchased out of state, there is an extended grace period for registration in Washington, and they can wait for a notification from the DOL. Option B. Immediately initiate the process to register the vehicle with the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) and obtain Washington license plates, understanding that operating a vehicle in Washington requires compliance with its registration laws regardless of recent purchase or out-of-state plates. Option C. Continue using the vehicle with Oregon plates until a traffic stop occurs, at which point they will explain the situation and attempt to register the vehicle immediately. Option D. Rely on advice from a friend who mentioned that as long as the vehicle is insured, registration in Washington is not an immediate concern. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate the process to register the vehicle with the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) and obtain Washington license plates, understanding that operating a vehicle in Washington requires compliance with its registration laws regardless of recent purchase or out-of-state plates. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows that understanding Washington State's traffic laws regarding vehicle registration and driver licensing is paramount for compliance and safe operation of a motor vehicle. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a driver to navigate the specific requirements of Washington state law, which mandates timely registration to avoid penalties and ensure legal operation. Misinterpreting or ignoring these requirements can lead to significant legal consequences, including fines, impoundment of the vehicle, and potential suspension of driving privileges. The correct approach involves proactively understanding and adhering to the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) regulations for vehicle registration. This means recognizing that a vehicle must be registered within a specific time frame after purchase or relocation into the state, and that operating an unregistered vehicle is a violation of Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-16A. 010. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal obligation to register a vehicle, ensuring it is legally permitted on Washington state roadways, and that the owner has met their civic duty. An incorrect approach would be to assume that registration is a minor administrative task that can be deferred indefinitely, or that out-of-state plates are acceptable for an extended period after establishing residency in Washington. This fails to acknowledge the specific residency requirements and registration deadlines set forth by Washington state law. Operating a vehicle with expired or invalid registration, even if recently purchased, violates RCW 46-16A. 010 and demonstrates a disregard for the state's regulatory framework. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on informal advice from friends or online forums that do not cite specific Washington state statutes or DOL guidance. This can lead to misinformation and noncompliance, as the legal requirements are precise and must be followed. The failure here is in not seeking authoritative information from the official Washington state DOL website or directly from the agency. A professional reasoning framework for such situations involves prioritizing legal compliance by consulting official sources for regulatory information. When in doubt about registration requirements, a driver should always refer to the Washington State DOL's official website, contact the DOL directly, or consult the relevant Revised Code of Washington, RCW sections. This proactive and authoritative information gathering process ensures that actions taken are in full compliance with state law, thereby avoiding legal repercussions and promoting responsible vehicle ownership. Question 9. Analysis of a scenario involving a minor collision in Washington state where the driver believes the damage is minimal. What is the most compliant and professionally responsible course of action regarding accident reporting and immediate post-collision duties? Option A. Wait for several days to report the collision to the authorities, allowing time to assess the full extent of the damage and the other party's response. Option B. Stop at the scene. Exchange information with the other driver and decide not to report the collision to authorities, believing the damage is too minor to warrant official intervention. Option C. Leave the scene immediately after confirming the other driver is unharmed and the damage appears insignificant, assuming no formal report is necessary. Option D. Immediately stop at the scene, assess for injuries, exchange required information with the other driver, and report the collision to the Washington State Patrol or local law enforcement if damage appears to exceed $1,000 or if there are any injuries. The correct answer is D. Immediately stop at the scene, assess for injuries, exchange required information with the other driver, and report the collision to the Washington State Patrol or local law enforcement if damage appears to exceed $1,000 or if there are any injuries. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a driver to navigate a situation where their immediate actions could have significant legal and safety consequences. The driver must balance the urgency of the situation with the strict requirements of Washington state traffic law regarding reporting accidents. Misinterpreting or ignoring these requirements can lead to penalties, including fines and license suspension, and could also impede the proper investigation of the incident. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with legal obligations while also addressing the immediate aftermath of the collision. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately stopping at the scene, assessing the situation for injuries, and then promptly reporting the collision to the Washington State Patrol or the local law enforcement agency. This approach aligns directly with Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-52-020, which mandates that drivers involved in an accident resulting in injury, death, or property damage must stop, render aid if necessary, and provide information. Crucially, the law also requires reporting the accident to the state patrol or local police if the damage exceeds a certain threshold or if directed by an officer. This ensures that an official record is created and that any necessary investigations can commence promptly, fulfilling the driver's legal duties. Incorrect approach is analysis. Failing to stop at the scene and leaving without reporting the collision is a direct violation of RCW 46-52-020. This constitutes a hit-and-run offense, which carries severe penalties. It prevents law enforcement from gathering crucial information and offering assistance, and it denies the other party the necessary information for insurance claims and repairs. Stopping but only exchanging information with the other driver without notifying law enforcement, even if the damage appears minor, can be problematic. While exchanging information is required, RCW 46-52-020 also mandates reporting to law enforcement if the damage exceeds $1,000 or if there are injuries. Circumventing this reporting requirement, even with good intentions, can lead to noncompliance if the damage is later found to be more extensive or if the other party disputes the assessment. Waiting an extended period, such as several days, to report the collision to authorities after the fact is also a failure to comply with the spirit and letter of the law. RCW 46-52-020 implies prompt reporting. Delaying the report can hinder the investigation, make it difficult to accurately assess damage, and may be viewed by authorities as an attempt to avoid responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should follow a clear decision-making framework. 1. Prioritize safety and immediate needs. Ensure all parties are safe and render aid if necessary. 2. Comply with immediate legal obligations. Stop the vehicle at the scene. 3. Fulfill reporting requirements. Ascertain if the collision meets the criteria for mandatory reporting to law enforcement under RCW 46-52-020 injury, death, or property damage exceeding $1,000. If it does, contact the Washington State Patrol or local police immediately. 4. Exchange information. Provide required information to the other driver. 5. Document the incident. Make notes of the circumstances, damage, and any witnesses. 6. Follow up. Complete any necessary written reports as required by law or insurance. Question 10. The review process indicates a need to assess understanding of Washington State's Graduated Driver Licensing (GDL) program. A new driver in Washington State has held their instruction permit for exactly 7 months and has completed 35 hours of supervised driving, of which 8 hours were at night. If the driver wishes to apply for their intermediate license, what is the minimum additional number of supervised driving hours, including night driving hours, they must complete to meet Washington State's requirements? Option A, 15 hours with no specific night driving requirement for the remaining hours. Option B, 25 hours including at least 2 more hours at night. Option C, 10 hours including at least 2 more hours at night. Option D, 15 hours including at least 2 more hours at night. The correct answer is D. 15 hours, including at least 2 more hours at night. Explanation. The review process indicates a need to assess understanding of Washington State's Graduated Driver Licensing (GDL) program, specifically concerning the financial implications of permit holding periods and the calculation of required supervised driving hours. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not only knowledge of specific GDL rules, but also the ability to apply mathematical principles to a real-world licensing context. Misinterpreting the regulations or miscalculating the hours could lead to a driver being issued a license prematurely or facing unnecessary delays, both of which have safety and compliance implications. The correct approach involves accurately calculating the minimum number of supervised driving hours required by Washington state law, taking into account the permit holding period and any specific hour requirements for night driving. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-055, which mandates specific supervised driving requirements for intermediate license applicants. The law requires 50 hours of supervised driving, including 10 hours at night, after holding an instruction permit for at least 6 months. Therefore, A precise calculation based on these figures is essential for compliance. An incorrect approach would be to simply estimate the required hours, or to use a simplified calculation that ignores the specific night driving requirement. This fails to meet the explicit legal mandates of RCW 46:20-055, potentially leading to a driver not being adequately prepared for solo driving. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that the permit holding period directly translates to the number of driving hours required, without considering the separate, explicit hour requirements. This misunderstands the structure of the GDL program, which separates the minimum permit duration from the minimum supervised practice duration. Finally, an approach that uses a generic number of hours without referencing the specific Washington state requirements would be fundamentally flawed, as it disregards the jurisdiction-specific regulations governing driver licensing. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to specific jurisdictional laws and regulations. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant statutes and rules e.g. RCW 46:20-055 for Washington State. 2. Extracting all quantitative requirements e.g. permit holding duration, total supervised hours, night driving hours. 3. Performing precise mathematical calculations based on these requirements. 4. Verifying the calculations against the legal text to ensure full compliance. Question 11. Performance analysis shows a common point of confusion for new drivers in Washington state involves understanding pedestrian right-of-way at intersections. A driver approaches a residential intersection with no painted lines indicating a crosswalk. A pedestrian is walking towards the edge of the road on the sidewalk, looking in the direction of the intersection. What is the legally required action for the driver in Washington state? Option A. Proceed through the intersection as there is no marked crosswalk. Option B. Yield to the pedestrian as they are approaching an unmarked crosswalk. Option C. Wait to see if the pedestrian makes eye contact before deciding whether to yield. Option D. Assume the pedestrian is not intending to cross and proceed cautiously. The correct answer is B. Yield to the pedestrian as they are approaching an unmarked crosswalk. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a driver applicant by testing their understanding of Washington state's specific traffic laws regarding yielding to pedestrians, particularly in a less common but legally significant situation. The challenge lies in applying the general principle of yielding to pedestrians to a scenario that might not be immediately obvious as a mandatory yielding situation, requiring careful interpretation of the law beyond just marked crosswalks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves recognizing that Washington state law requires drivers to yield to pedestrians in any marked or unmarked crosswalk. This approach correctly identifies the intersection as containing an unmarked crosswalk where pedestrians have the right of way. Washington state's Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46:61-235, explicitly states that drivers must yield the right of way to pedestrians in a marked or unmarked crosswalk. This approach adheres strictly to the regulatory framework by prioritizing pedestrian safety and understanding the full scope of the law, not just the most common scenarios. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails to yield because the crosswalk is unmarked. This is a regulatory failure because it ignores RCW 46:61-235, which extends the yielding requirement to unmarked crosswalks at intersections. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the law's protective scope for pedestrians. Another incorrect approach assumes the pedestrian is not intending to cross. This is an ethical and regulatory failure. Drivers are not permitted to assume a pedestrian's intentions. The law mandates yielding when a pedestrian is present in a crosswalk, regardless of their perceived intent. This approach prioritizes the driver's convenience over the pedestrian's legal right of way and safety. A further incorrect approach yields only because the pedestrian is looking directly at the driver. While this might be a signal of intent, it is not the legal basis for yielding. The legal basis is the presence of the pedestrian in the crosswalk, marked or unmarked. Relying on visual cues rather than the established legal requirement is a misapplication of traffic law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the presence of a crosswalk, whether marked or unmarked, at an intersection. They should then recall the specific Washington state law, RCW 46:61-235, that mandates yielding to pedestrians in such crosswalks. If there is any doubt about the presence of a crosswalk or a pedestrian's presence within it, the safest and legally compliant action is to slow down and be prepared to yield. This proactive approach prioritizes safety and ensures adherence to regulatory requirements, preventing potential violations and ensuring the well-being of all road users. Question 12. Compliance review shows a driver's license examiner in Washington state has just concluded a road test. During the test, the applicant failed to come to a complete stop at a stop sign, rolling through the intersection before proceeding. The examiner is now deciding how to document this event for the applicant's record. Which of the following documentation approaches best aligns with Washington state's regulatory framework for driver licensing and promotes professional integrity? Option A. Document the failure by noting failure to stop completely at stop sign and referencing the specific section of the Washington State Driver Guide that outlines the requirement for a complete stop. Option B. Document the failure as inadequate observation at intersection, as the applicant's rolling stop suggests they may not have observed traffic adequately. Option C. Pass the applicant but make a note that the applicant needs to be more careful at stop signs in the future, due to the examiner's perception of the applicant's overall driving demeanor. Option D. Document the failure as minor hesitation at stop sign, and explain that while not ideal, it did not pose an immediate safety risk in this specific instance. The correct answer is A. Document the failure by noting failure to stop completely at stop sign and referencing the specific section of the Washington State Driver Guide that outlines the requirement for a complete stop. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a driver's license examiner in Washington state. The challenge lies in balancing the need to adhere strictly to the Washington State Driver Guide and the practical realities of assessing a candidate's ability to operate a vehicle safely in varied conditions. The examiner must make a judgment call that upholds safety standards while also being fair and consistent in their evaluation, all within the framework of Washington state's licensing regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves the examiner meticulously documenting the specific reason for the failure, referencing the relevant section of the Washington State Driver Guide that was violated. This approach is correct because it ensures transparency, accountability, and consistency in the licensing process. Washington state's licensing regulations emphasize objective assessment based on established rules and safe driving practices. By citing the specific guide section, the examiner provides clear justification for their decision, which is crucial for the applicant's understanding and for any potential appeals or reviews. This aligns with the principle of regulatory compliance, ensuring that licensing decisions are based on established legal and safety standards. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply state that the applicant failed to demonstrate safe driving skills without further elaboration. This is professionally unacceptable because it lacks specificity and does not provide the applicant with actionable feedback. It fails to meet the regulatory requirement for clear and justifiable reasons for license denial, making the decision appear arbitrary and undermining the integrity of the testing process. Another incorrect approach is to pass the applicant despite a clear violation of a fundamental safety rule, such as failing to yield to pedestrians in a marked crosswalk, with the reasoning that the applicant seemed nervous and the examiner wanted to be lenient. This is a serious regulatory and ethical failure. Washington State's Driver Guide explicitly outlines critical safety maneuvers and rules. Overlooking a violation of such a rule compromises public safety and violates the examiner's duty to ensure all licensed drivers meet minimum safety standards. This approach prioritizes subjective feelings over objective safety requirements. A further incorrect approach is to fail the applicant based on a minor infraction that is not explicitly covered as a failure point in the Washington State Driver Guide, such as a slight hesitation at an intersection where no traffic was present. While caution is important, licensing decisions must be grounded in the established criteria. Failing an applicant for something not defined as a failure in the official guide is inconsistent with regulatory compliance and can lead to unfair outcomes. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective adherence to the Washington State Driver Guide. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding all aspects of the driver guide and the criteria for passing and failing. 2. conducting the test with undivided attention, observing all maneuvers. 3. If a potential failure occurs, immediately identifying the specific rule or safety principle violated from the driver guide. 4. Documenting the infraction with precise detail, including the location and nature of the violation, and referencing the relevant section of the driver guide. 5. Communicating the decision and the reasons clearly and respectfully to the applicant, providing specific feedback for improvement. This systematic approach ensures fairness, consistency, and upholds the paramount importance of public safety on Washington state roadways. Question 13. Investigation of a learner's permit holder's driving practices in Washington state reveals a situation where the permit holder is driving with a licensed driver who is over 18 but has only held their license for 6 months. Based on Washington state regulations, what is the correct course of action for the permit holder to ensure compliance? Option A. The permit holder may continue driving as long as the licensed driver is over 18 and in the front passenger seat. Option B. The permit holder must immediately stop driving and wait for a licensed driver who has held their license for at least 4 years to occupy the front passenger seat. Option C. The permit holder may continue driving if another permit holder is present in the vehicle to offer advice. Option D. The permit holder may continue driving if the licensed driver is in the back seat, providing supervision from a distance. The correct answer is B. The permit holder must immediately stop driving and wait for a licensed driver who has held their license for at least 4 years to occupy the front passenger seat. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the Washington State Department of Licensing, DOL, regulations regarding the proper use of a learner's permit. The core challenge lies in understanding the specific conditions under which a permit holder can operate a vehicle and the responsibilities of the supervising driver. Misinterpreting these rules can lead to violations, potential license suspension, and safety risks. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and safe driving practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves strictly adhering to the Washington State DOL's requirements for learners' permit holders. This means ensuring that a licensed driver who meets the age and experience criteria specified by Washington law is present in the front passenger seat at all times while the permit holder is driving. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-055, which outlines the conditions for operating a vehicle with a learner's permit, emphasizing the presence of a qualified supervising driver. This ensures the permit holder receives adequate supervision and guidance, promoting safety and compliance with state law. Incorrect approaches analysis. Operating a vehicle with only another permit holder in the car is a regulatory failure. Washington state law requires a licensed driver meeting specific criteria to supervise. Having another permit holder does not fulfill this requirement, violating RCW 46-20-055 and potentially leading to penalties for both individuals. Driving with a licensed driver in the back seat while the permit holder drives is also a regulatory failure. The law specifies the supervising driver must be in the front passenger seat to provide immediate guidance and control if necessary, as per RCW 46-20-055. A driver in the back seat cannot effectively supervise in the manner intended by the regulation. Allowing a friend who has had their license for less than 1 year to supervise, even if they are over 18, is a regulatory failure. Washington state law under RCW 46-20-055 mandates that the supervising driver must have held a valid driver's license for at least 4 years, not just be over 18 and have held it for less than a year. This specific experience requirement is crucial for effective supervision. Professional reasoning. Professionals encountering situations involving learners' permits should always consult the most current Washington State DOL driver guide and relevant statutes, like RCW 46-20-055. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the DOL or a qualified driving instructor is paramount. The decision-making process should prioritize safety and strict adherence to legal requirements over convenience or assumptions. Understanding the specific age, experience, and seating position requirements for the supervising driver is non-negotiable. Question 14. Comparative studies suggest that individuals seeking a Washington state learner's permit with pre-existing medical conditions face unique challenges in navigating the application process. Considering the information typically found in the Washington State Driver's Guide, what is the most responsible and compliant approach for an applicant who has a diagnosed condition that might affect their driving ability? Option A. Proceed with the learner's permit application without mentioning the medical condition, assuming it is not significant enough to impact driving. Option B. Rely on personal judgment and past driving experience to determine if the medical condition poses a risk and proceed accordingly. Option C. Contact the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) to inquire about specific requirements and potential medical evaluations related to the condition. Option D. Seek advice from friends or family members who have similar medical conditions and have obtained driver's licenses. The correct answer is C. Contact the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) to inquire about specific requirements and potential medical evaluations related to the condition. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the Washington State Driver's Guide requirements for obtaining a learner's permit, while also considering the practical implications of a medical condition. The challenge lies in balancing the need for accurate information and adherence to regulations with the personal circumstances of the applicant, ensuring that the process is both compliant and supportive. Careful judgment is required to determine the most appropriate course of action that upholds the integrity of the licensing process and the safety of the applicant and the public. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking guidance from the Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) regarding the specific medical condition and its potential impact on driving ability. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory framework established by Washington State. The DOL is the authoritative body responsible for determining medical fitness to drive and will have established procedures and requirements for applicants with specific health concerns, as outlined in the Washington State Driver's Guide and related administrative rules. This ensures that the applicant receives accurate, up-to-date information and follows the prescribed legal pathway, which may involve medical evaluations or specific endorsements. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply ignore the medical condition and proceed with the learner's permit application as if there were no health concerns. This is a regulatory failure because it violates the spirit and letter of the Washington State Driver's Guide, which mandates disclosure of conditions that could impair driving ability. It also poses a significant public safety risk. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on anecdotal advice from friends or family about the condition's impact on driving. This is ethically problematic and a regulatory failure because it bypasses the official channels for assessing driving competency. The Washington State Driver's Guide emphasizes official procedures and assessments, not informal opinions, for determining eligibility. A third incorrect approach is to assume that the condition is minor and will not affect driving without any official consultation. This is a failure of due diligence and a potential regulatory violation. The Washington State Driver's Guide requires a responsible assessment of one's ability to drive safely, and this assessment should be informed by official guidance or medical professionals, not personal assumptions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a systematic approach. First, they must identify the relevant regulatory framework, in this case, the Washington State Driver's Guide and DOL regulations. Second, they should assess the specific circumstances of the applicant, including any disclosed medical conditions. Third, they must determine the most compliant and responsible course of action, which involves consulting the authoritative body DOL for guidance. This decision-making process prioritizes regulatory adherence, public safety, and ethical conduct. Question 15. The investigation demonstrates that a driver's license applicant in Washington State has submitted an application form with a section for vision test results left blank, accompanied by a handwritten note stating vision test pending. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the licensing agent to take to ensure compliance with Washington State's driver licensing regulations? Option A. Inform the applicant that the vision test results must be officially documented and submitted by an approved provider before the application can be fully processed, and provide them with information on approved vision testing locations. Option B. Accept a verbal confirmation from the applicant that they have scheduled or completed their vision test. Option C. Proceed with processing the application, assuming the applicant will pass the vision test, and flag the file for follow-up. Option D. Accept the application with the note and inform the applicant that they will be contacted once the vision test results are received. The correct answer is A. Inform the applicant that the vision test results must be officially documented and submitted by an approved provider before the application can be fully processed, and provide them with information on approved vision testing locations. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a driver's license applicant in Washington state has provided incomplete information on their application, specifically regarding their vision test results. This presents a professional challenge because the Washington State Department of Licensing, DOL, has strict requirements for vision testing to ensure public safety on the roadways. Failing to adhere to these requirements can lead to issuing licenses to individuals who may not meet the minimum visual acuity standards, thereby compromising road safety. Careful judgment is required to balance the applicant's desire to obtain a license with the DOL's mandate to protect the public. The best approach involves ensuring all required documentation, including a properly completed vision screening, is submitted and verified before proceeding with the license application. This aligns with Washington State's Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-041, which outlines the requirements for vision tests for driver's license applicants. The DOL's administrative rules, such as those found in the Washington Administrative Code, WAC, further detail the acceptable methods and standards for vision testing. By requiring the applicant to complete the vision test at an approved facility and submit the official results, the licensing agent upholds the integrity of the licensing process and adheres to the legal framework designed to ensure driver competency. An incorrect approach would be to accept the application with a note indicating the vision test is pending, without obtaining confirmation of the results. This bypasses the mandatory vision screening requirement stipulated by Washington state law and could result in a license being issued to someone who does not meet the necessary visual standards, creating a direct safety risk. Another incorrect approach is to assume the applicant will pass the vision test and proceed with processing the application, as this is a premature action that does not guarantee compliance with legal requirements. Finally, accepting a verbal confirmation of passing the vision test from the applicant without official documentation is also unacceptable, as it lacks the verifiable proof required by the DOL and opens the door to potential misrepresentation. Professionals in this situation should employ a systematic process of verifying all required documentation against the established legal and administrative requirements of the Washington State DOL. This involves a checklist approach, ensuring each piece of information and each required test is properly documented and validated before moving to the next stage of the application process. When in doubt, consulting the official DOL guidelines or seeking clarification from a supervisor is paramount to ensure compliance and maintain public safety. Question 16. Assessment of driver decision-making in Washington State. While approaching a busy intersection, a driver observes the traffic signal turn from yellow to red. Simultaneously, a pedestrian begins to cross the street in the crosswalk on the far side of the intersection, and a vehicle in the adjacent lane to the right begins to turn right. What is the most responsible course of action for the driver to take to ensure compliance with Washington state traffic laws and promote safety? Option A. Stop abruptly within the intersection to avoid hitting the pedestrian, regardless of the traffic signal status. Option B. Stop before the intersection, yielding to the pedestrian and the turning vehicle, and wait for the signal to turn green and the intersection to be clear. Option C. Accelerate through the intersection to avoid a red light violation, assuming the pedestrian and turning vehicle will complete their actions before the driver reaches them. Option D. Proceed cautiously into the intersection, honking the horn to alert the pedestrian and the turning vehicle to the driver's presence. The correct answer is B. Stop before the intersection, yielding to the pedestrian and the turning vehicle, and wait for the signal to turn green and the intersection to be clear. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a driver to balance the immediate need to navigate a complex intersection with the overarching responsibility to adhere to traffic laws and ensure the safety of all road users. The driver must process multiple visual cues, predict the actions of other drivers, and make a decision that is both efficient and lawful, all under potential time pressure. Careful judgment is required to avoid creating a hazardous situation or violating traffic regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the driver actively scanning the intersection for all potential hazards, including pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicles in all lanes, and yielding to any traffic already lawfully in the intersection or approaching in a manner that would constitute a right-of-way conflict. This approach is correct because Washington state's traffic laws, specifically Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-61-150 regarding obedience to traffic control signals, mandate that drivers must obey traffic signals and yield to traffic already in the intersection. Prioritizing a clear path and ensuring no immediate conflict exists before proceeding is the safest and most legally compliant action. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding into the intersection immediately upon the light turning green without confirming it is clear of other vehicles or pedestrians is a regulatory failure. This violates the principle of yielding to traffic already lawfully in the intersection, as per RCW 46-61-150, and creates a significant safety hazard. Assuming other drivers will yield or that the intersection is clear based solely on the green light is a dangerous assumption and a violation of the driver's duty of care. Attempting to beat a potentially changing light by accelerating rapidly into the intersection, even if the light is still green, is also a failure. This action prioritizes speed over safety and could lead to a collision if the light turns yellow or red before the driver clears the intersection, or if another vehicle unexpectedly enters the intersection. Furthermore, it demonstrates a disregard for the potential consequences of aggressive driving. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach to intersection navigation. This involves a comprehensive visual sweep of the intersection before entering, identifying all potential conflicts, and making a decision based on established right-of-way rules and the principle of defensive driving. The decision-making process should prioritize safety and legal compliance above all else, even if it means a slight delay. This involves understanding and applying the specific traffic laws of Washington state, such as those governing traffic signals and yielding. Question 17. The audit findings indicate a recurring issue with the processing of new driver's license applications at a Washington State Department of Licensing (DAL) branch, leading to delays in updating applicant records in the statewide system. Considering the Washington State Revised Code (RCW) and Washington Administrative Code (WAC) governing driver licensing, which of the following process optimization strategies would best ensure both timely processing and regulatory compliance? Option A. Bypass the secondary review step for applications to expedite the overall processing time. Option B. Implement a multi-stage verification process with immediate data entry upon application submission, followed by a supervisor review before final system commit. Option C. Conduct periodic, unscheduled audits of the system to identify and correct errors after they have been entered. Option D. Continue with manual batch processing of all applications at the end of each business day to consolidate data entry efforts. The correct answer is B. Implement a multi-stage verification process with immediate data entry upon application submission, followed by a supervisor review before final system commit. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a recurring issue with the processing of new driver's license applications at a Washington State Department of Licensing (DAL) branch. Specifically, there are delays in updating applicant records in the statewide system, leading to potential discrepancies and customer dissatisfaction. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing efficiency with accuracy and adherence to strict state regulations governing driver licensing. The DOL operates under the Revised Code of Washington, RCW, and Washington Administrative Code, WAC, which mandate timely and accurate record-keeping for public safety and administrative purposes. Failure to comply can result in system integrity issues, potential for fraudulent activity, and erosion of public trust. The best approach involves implementing a streamlined, multi-stage verification process that leverages technology and clear procedural guidelines. This includes immediate data entry upon application submission, followed by a secondary review by a supervisor before final system commit. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the root cause of the delays by creating distinct checkpoints for accuracy and completeness without creating an undue bottleneck. It aligns with the DOL's mandate to maintain accurate and up-to-date driver records as required by RCW 46-20-031, which outlines the requirements for driver's license issuance and record maintenance. The immediate data entry ensures the application is captured, and the secondary review prevents errors from propagating through the system, thereby optimizing the process for both speed and compliance. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on manual batch processing at the end of each day. This is professionally unacceptable because it significantly increases the risk of errors accumulating and delays the availability of accurate information in the statewide system, potentially violating the spirit and letter of WAC 308-104-160, which emphasizes the importance of accurate and current licensing records. Another incorrect approach is to bypass the secondary review to speed up processing. This is ethically and regulatorily unsound, as it compromises the integrity of the licensing process and increases the likelihood of erroneous data entering the system, which could have serious implications for law enforcement and public safety, directly contravening the principles of responsible record management mandated by state law. Finally, an approach that involves only occasional system audits without addressing the daily processing workflow fails to proactively prevent issues and is therefore insufficient for maintaining operational efficiency and compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance, data integrity, and customer service. This involves understanding the specific requirements of the governing statutes and administrative codes, identifying potential points of failure in the current process, and implementing solutions that are both efficient and robust. Regular training on updated procedures and system functionalities, coupled with performance monitoring, is crucial for continuous improvement. Question 18. Regulatory review indicates that a driver's license applicant at a Washington state licensing office presents a birth certificate and a utility bill for proof of identity and residency, but the utility bill is not in their name. The applicant states they live with a relative, and the bill is in the relative's name. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing agent to ensure compliance with Washington state's driver licensing regulations? Option A. Inform the applicant that the utility bill is insufficient and deny their application for failing to provide adequate proof of residency. Option B. Issue a temporary permit to the applicant while they gather additional proof of residency, allowing them to drive in the interim. Option C. Request alternative documentation that clearly establishes the applicant's residency in Washington state, such as a lease agreement, school enrollment records, or a notarized letter from the relative confirming the applicant's residence at their address. Option D. Accept the utility bill as proof of residency, as it indicates the applicant is living at that address, and proceed with issuing the license. The correct answer is C. Request alternative documentation that clearly establishes the applicant's residency in Washington state, such as a lease agreement, school enrollment records, or a notarized letter from the relative confirming the applicant's residence at their address. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a driver's license with the legal and safety requirements mandated by Washington state law. A licensing agent must exercise careful judgment to ensure all applicants meet the established criteria without undue delay or compromise of public safety. The pressure to process applications efficiently can create a temptation to overlook minor discrepancies, which could have serious consequences. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all submitted documentation against the requirements outlined in the Washington State Driver Guide and relevant revised Code of Washington, RCW, statutes governing driver licensing. This approach ensures that the applicant has provided all necessary proof of identity, residency, and legal presence, and has met any age or testing prerequisites. Adhering strictly to these established legal requirements is paramount to upholding the integrity of the licensing process and ensuring that only qualified individuals are granted driving privileges, thereby protecting public safety on Washington roadways. This meticulous verification process is a core ethical and legal obligation of a licensing agent. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the applicant's verbal assurance of residency without verifying it against the accepted forms of documentation. This fails to comply with Washington State's proof of residency requirements, which are designed to ensure that individuals are genuinely residing within the state and are subject to its laws. This oversight could lead to licenses being issued to individuals who do not meet residency criteria, potentially undermining state administrative processes and public safety. Another incorrect approach is to overlook the missing signature on the application form, assuming it is a minor clerical error. Washington state licensing applications require specific attestations and signatures to confirm the applicant's understanding and agreement to the terms and conditions of the license. Failing to obtain a signature means the application is incomplete and invalid according to the established procedures, and it bypasses a critical step in the legal process of obtaining a driver's license. A further incorrect approach is to expedite the issuance of the license because the applicant claims to be in a hurry for work. While efficiency is desirable, it cannot supersede legal requirements. Washington state law does not provide exceptions for expedited licensing based on an applicant's personal circumstances or perceived urgency. Prioritizing expediency over legal compliance compromises the integrity of the licensing system and potentially places an unqualified driver on the road. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a systematic checklist approach, cross-referencing each piece of documentation and each step of the application process against the official Washington State Driver Guide and relevant RCWs. When faced with incomplete or questionable information, the professional decision-making process dictates seeking clarification or additional documentation from the applicant, rather than making assumptions or waiving requirements. If an applicant cannot meet the legal requirements, the professional must explain the specific reasons for denial and guide the applicant on how to rectify the situation to meet the state's standards. Question 19. Consider a scenario where an individual applying for a driver's license at a Washington State Department of Licensing (DOL) office presents incomplete documentation, stating they are a resident but lack a utility bill or lease agreement to prove it, and express urgency to obtain their license. What is the most appropriate course of action for the DOL licensing agent to ensure compliance with Washington State's driver's licensing regulations? Option A. Issue the driver's license with a note indicating that the applicant must provide the missing proof of residency within a specified time frame. Option B. Advise the applicant to try obtaining a driver's license in a neighboring state where they might have more readily available proof of residency. Option C. Clearly explain to the applicant that all required documentation, including proof of identity and residency in Washington State, must be presented and verified before a driver's license can be issued, and provide information on acceptable forms of proof. Option D. Issue a temporary permit to the applicant, allowing them to drive while they gather the remaining documentation. The correct answer is C. Clearly explain to the applicant that all required documentation, including proof of identity and residency in Washington State, must be presented and verified before a driver's license can be issued, and provide information on acceptable forms of proof. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a driver's license with the legal and safety requirements mandated by Washington state law. The applicant's eagerness to obtain the license, coupled with their incomplete understanding of the process, creates a situation where a licensing agent must act with integrity and adherence to regulations, even if it means delaying the issuance of a license. The agent's role is not merely administrative. It involves safeguarding public safety by ensuring all legal prerequisites are met. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to clearly explain to the applicant that all required documentation, including proof of identity and residency in Washington State, must be presented and verified before a driver's license can be issued. This approach aligns directly with Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-035, which outlines the requirements for obtaining a driver's license, including proof of identity and lawful presence in the state. By adhering to this, the agent upholds the integrity of the licensing process and ensures compliance with state law, prioritizing public safety and the legal framework governing driver licensing in Washington. Incorrect approaches analysis. Providing a temporary permit without the applicant presenting all required proof of identity and residency would violate RCW 46-20-035. This action bypasses essential verification steps, potentially allowing individuals who do not meet the state's criteria to operate a vehicle, thereby compromising public safety and undermining the legal requirements for licensing. Issuing the license with a promise from the applicant to provide the missing documentation later is also a violation. This approach creates a loophole in the verification process, similar to the previous incorrect approach, and fails to ensure that the applicant legally resides in Washington state, which is a fundamental requirement under RCW 46-20-035, suggesting the applicant obtain a driver's license in another state where they might have easier access to documentation is inappropriate and potentially misleading. The licensing agent's responsibility is to process applications according to Washington state law. Directing an applicant to circumvent Washington's requirements by seeking a license elsewhere is outside the scope of their duties and does not address the applicant's immediate need within the correct legal framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals in licensing roles should always prioritize adherence to the specific laws and regulations of their jurisdiction. When faced with an applicant who does not meet all requirements, the decision-making process should involve 1. Clearly identifying the missing requirements based on the relevant statutes, in this case, RCW 46-20-035. 2. Communicating these requirements to the applicant in a clear and helpful manner. 3. Explaining the consequences of not meeting these requirements, which is the inability to issue the license. 4. Offering guidance on how the applicant can meet the requirements. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all legal and safety standards are met before any license is issued. Question 20. Upon reviewing an applicant's file for a Washington state driver's license, you note the instruction permit was issued on March 15, 2023, and the applicant turned 16 on September 10, 2023. The applicant completed their driver education course and passed the knowledge test on January 20, 2024. If the applicant wishes to apply for an intermediate driver's license, what is the earliest date they can legally do so, assuming all other requirements are met? Option A, January 20, 2025. Option B, March 10, 2024. Option C, September 10, 2024. Option D, March 15, 2024. The correct answer is D, March 15, 2024. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise understanding of Washington State's graduated driver licensing (GDL) program and the ability to apply mathematical calculations to determine eligibility based on timeframes. Misinterpreting the GDL rules or miscalculating the required waiting periods could lead to an applicant being incorrectly advised, potentially resulting in a violation of licensing regulations or unnecessary delays for the applicant. Careful judgment is required to ensure all conditions are met before advising on the next licensing step. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves accurately calculating the minimum 12-month waiting period from the date the instruction permit was issued, ensuring at least 6 months of that period have passed since the applicant turned 16, and then verifying that the applicant has completed the required driver education and passed the knowledge test. This approach directly adheres to the Washington State GDL requirements outlined in Revised Code of Washington, RCW 46-20-055. Specifically, the law mandates that an applicant must hold an instruction permit for at least 12 months and be at least 16 years old before applying for an intermediate license. The calculation of the 12-month period from the permit issuance date is a critical mathematical component of this process. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the applicant based solely on their age turning 16 without confirming the full 12-month permit holding period is a regulatory failure. GDL program prioritizes supervised driving experience over mere age, suggesting the applicant can apply for the intermediate license immediately after completing driver education, irrespective of the 12-month permit holding period or age requirement, is a violation of RCW 46-20-055. The educational component is a prerequisite, but not the sole determinant of eligibility. Calculating the 12-month waiting period from the date the applicant passed the knowledge test, rather than the date the instruction permit was issued, is a mathematical misapplication of the GDL rules. The permit issuance date is the legally defined starting point for the mandatory holding period. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach. First, identify the applicant's current license status and the date of their instruction permit issuance. Second, determine the applicant's age and the date they turned 16. Third, calculate the 12-month waiting period from the permit issuance date. Fourth, verify that the applicant meets the age requirement of 16 years old and that at least 6 months of the permit holding period have passed since turning 16. Fifth, Confirm completion of all required driver education courses and successful passage of the knowledge test. This structured process ensures all legal requirements are met before proceeding.